Hey everybody, and welcome to the Polybox. As you might have already guessed from the title, we are going to be talking about the Redshift Sampler today. Many people have problems understanding how the Redshift Sampler works, and honestly the documentation on it isn't too clear about it, but it's actually not that bad if you understand exactly how it works, or you don't even have to understand exactly how it works. But it's not that hard to understand, and once you got it, you can get some really fast renderings out of Redshift with a lot of control. And recently there's also been added a new function that pretty much automatically samples the entire scene, though I've had some problems with it when it doesn't work correctly and doesn't clean up some parts of the image. So it's still good to know how the sampler works. And the automatic setting is even in the experimental drop-down menu in the render settings, so I'm not surprised it doesn't work perfectly yet, but if they get it to work at some point, it's going to be a game changer for setting up Redshift, because again, it's not that complicated, but it's still something that you have to do compared to something like Octane, for example, where you just go up with one setting and the entire scene suddenly looks better and gets sampled fine. Redshift is not that easy, but on the other hand, Redshift is also very fast and you have a lot of control over it. So yeah, let's begin. So the first thing you have to understand in Redshift is that the unified sampler is not responsible for the overall image. The unified sampler, in most cases, can be left to the default settings unless you have depth of field, motion blur, or any other camera-related effect in the scene. What is responsible for the image quality is the sampling settings in the materials, or if you're lazy like me, the sampling overrides. So I have prepared the sample scene here, and it usually, it has depth of field enabled. So what we're going to do is increase or set up the sampling settings piece by piece or AOV by AOV until we get a satisfactory noise level, and then we're going to adjust the sample filtering to get a good depth of field result. Now, the first thing you have to do is enable bucket rendering in the preview, because the non-bucket rendering just constantly refines the image, but your final render is usually going to be with bucket rendering. So whatever you see here is good for previewing, but it's only good for your final render quality if you enable bucket rendering up here. And as you can see now with default settings, the image is pretty shit, honestly. It's super grainy, there's noise everywhere, but we're gonna fix that. So the first thing you want to do is, if you have that enabled, you want to disable depth of field and motion blur. So let's do that first. And now we pretty much only have the image without other camera effects, so we can work on the sampling directly. Now, the next thing I always do is I add the AOV channels I have in the scene or used in the scene, so I can directly view which AOV does the noise that I still have in the scene. So open up the AOV manager and then grab whatever you have in the scene. We have pretty much everything here of the main AOVs, because I've added all the materials to show it, but usually you don't have everything in a scene. So we have reflections, we have refractions, we have shadows, we have subsurface scatter, we have emission, and that should be it for now. If we have anything else, we can just add it later. All right. So first thing I always try to get rid of in a scene is the noise from the dome light, which, if I have a dome light, it's usually set way too low, as you can see if we go to the shadows channel here, like this, the shadows AOV. It just shows us lighting and shadows, and as you can see, it's noisy as all hell. So go into your dome light and just increase the sample count here to something until it looks relatively clean. Now the shadows channel sometimes looks dirty, even though the final image is already fine, so don't overdo it on the sampling here. Usually I just go back to my beauty pass and check if my shadows are already clean enough. In this case, they're not. So let's grab this tool here and get a better look at this so we can work faster. And let's double the samples. This is already better, but maybe we can go higher. Let's see what the difference is. Not much. Let's go with 1,500 samples for now. That looks... how does the overall image look? Yeah, that looks clean enough for now. Let's go with 248 samples, just to be sure. Okay. Now we have cleared up our shadows. This can also happen to area lights, of course. The bigger they are, like if you get super smooth shadows or you have a very small light, you might have to increase the samples on your area lights as well. If we go to our shadows channel now, you can see that the important parts are pretty much clean. But again, shadows always looks noisier than the final image actually is. I don't know why exactly, so just take this as a kind of, with a grain of salt and just look at your final image. So the next thing we are going to look at is reflections. And as you can see, there's still a very, very, very noisy reflection here. Now, with everything in Redshift, we have super fine control. And if you want, you can go into every single material in your scene and set up the samples of every single channel of every single material in your scene. I usually don't do that because it takes a lot of time and it's usually just not worth the extra amount of time. But if you want, you can go, in this case, it's the gold material, into your material and go to the respective channel. In this case, it's reflections. And increase that until you have something that you're happy with. And as always, try to speed up your workflow and only render what is actually interesting. So that was not enough. 512, how does that look in the beauty? Still a little grainy. So we are going to increase that even further. Sometimes you really have to use ridiculous numbers. Just increase it until you're happy. But I think in this case, we can still get a better quality. Yeah, this looks fine. Now, as I said, I don't recommend doing that because it's a lot of work. Sometimes it's worth it, but most of the time it's not. So unless you have to render hundreds of images or thousands of images, I don't think it's worth it. So we just reset that to default and we do it the lazy way. All right, let's go on 100% again. The lazy way is go back to your render settings, go to basic and then sampling overrides. What this does is it overrides every single sample setting in the scene in the respective AOV. So in this case, we can override reflection sampling for the entire scene. Now there's two settings to this. Either you can replace samples, which replaces the samples as the name implies, but I usually like to use the scale setting because I can just multiply by whatever's already in there. So the base here is 16 samples. So if we go to 2, we are going to get 32, etc., etc. So just increase that until you get a result that you are happy with. 25. We can disable this at this point, just not the bucket rendering, sorry. We can disable the area render at this point and just have a look at our AOV again. These are usually not hard to render because the super glossy materials are not hard to render, but as soon as you get roughness in it, you need more samples. So this is obviously still super grainy, so we still increase the sample count. Not enough. As you can see, it still renders really fast, so we're at 1,600 samples now, so 3,200 samples for this. All right, I think that looks clean enough for now. Okay, back to our beauty channel. We can see that our glossy reflections are really sharp now. And next thing is refractions, which is basically everything transparent that refracts. Who would have guessed refracts materials? Now, as I said before, super shiny is usually not an issue. As you can see, that is really clean, but this is not. So same story. Refraction, save for now. Refractions, scale, and just increase that until you get a result that you like. And take your handy area rendering tool again, because that can take a while. All right, 50 was not enough, still noisy. 100, 150. How does that look in the beauty? Ugh, no. We need way more. Still looks like crap. That is a little better, but I still don't like it. Let's go with 500. As I said, sometimes you just need ridiculous numbers to get a good result. Does that even make a difference anymore? It does. Okay. How does it look at 100%? Yeah, still not 100% happy with it. Rendering. Refractions. Yeah, that looks fine, I think. That's fine for now. All right. Beauty. Okay, what do we still have? Where do we still have noise in the image? The subsurface scattering still looks bad. All right, so let's take a look at the subsurface scattering sampling. Let's take this over there and scroll down. And you have the subsurface moldable scattering here. Let's go to that and do the same thing. Increase until we're happy. And that already looks way better. Subsurface scattering. So we can have a closer look at how well it actually renders. This is a little better. Now some of these things might be hard to see with the YouTube compression, but I assure you there's a difference if I still increase to a certain point. You just have to try that out yourself. 200. All right. I think that's okay. Beauty. Okay. And as you can see, it only renders longer in the parts of the image that are hard to render or where we increased the sample count, which is one of the advantages of Redshift, that it's just super fast whenever it doesn't have to render super hard or think super hard. Let's just go with fill window for now. That looks good. Come on. Come on, come on. There we go. I'm still not happy with the shadows. If I look at the overall noise in the image, I think we still need more samples on our dome light. So let's go fit window and take a harder look at the area shadows here, like this. And this is way better, I think. But we could still do with more. It doesn't actually cost that much render time. So why not just increase the shadows, right? All right, that looks way better. Let's render this out again. Depending on your scene, this entire work thing can can take a while, so I recommend using the area rendering tool as much as possible, because you can just render the areas that are as noisy as are the noisiest in the scene, and you can save yourself loads of time by just doing that. There we go. Like, that looks great. Okay, now for the interesting part, the unified sampler. Of course, depending on what you have in your scene, you're going to use the overrides here. We don't need those because we don't use those. And we can close this up for now and open up the unified sampler. So next step is re-enabling depth of field. And then take a look at how horrible our depth of field is looking, even though we have a grain-free scene when it comes to materials and all the other stuff in the scene. Look how dirty that depth of field looks. And this is where the unified sampler comes in. As I said, if you don't use depth of field, and as you could see before we enabled it again, you don't really have to use or touch the unified sampler, except maybe the adaptive error threshold. But we are going to solve our depth of field problem here now. So next step, enable clay rendering. So you can actually render the scene way faster because we only have default materials and a light in the scene. And we can just work faster. Again, area tool, and go to the noisiest part of the image, which is usually in the most shallow depth of field area. And increase your samples min and samples max at the same time to the same value. What that does is basically, like, usually the unified sampler balances areas that don't need as many samples with the minimum, and areas that need loads of samples go towards the maximum. If we keep them at the same value, the renderer is just going to use exactly these amounts of samples on every pixel that is being rendered up until this threshold is reached. And if it doesn't reach it, well, you're still going to have a noisier image than this here. You can actually visualize that if you go to the samples setting. White means bad, as in I used the maximum amount of samples you have allowed me, but I could not reach this adaptive error threshold, which means if we decrease that up to a certain point, we should get a image that is not pure white, but we have to go really far down, I think. Yeah, that's not working at all. But for example, if we go to 512, 512. Oh yeah, right. I'm dumb, sorry. This samples view only works if you don't have the same min and max, because, you know, we're always using the maximum amount. So if you go to something like 16 and 512, you can see in the gray area, I didn't need that many samples to get your adaptive error threshold, but these areas, I had barely enough, and here I didn't have enough. So you can use that to verify how hard your scene is getting sampled. But I usually just go with I, because as you can see, there's still a lot of noise in here. So let's go up until we have a satisfactory image. This still looks a little grainy, so we can go further. 1024. Sometimes it helps to refresh the render, because then he starts from fresh and you can really see the difference. That looks relatively clean. Let's look at it in 100%. Yep, that looks good already. 1024 seems to do the trick, and then again, check if samples are fine. And go down on this. Could still use some more samples in this area. We could still use some more samples in that area. Maybe we just decrease our adaptive error threshold so we get a better image as well, because I think it's still a little grainy. What do the samples say now? Yeah, we need more. So 248, 248, 248. Go back to clay. Yep, that looks okay, I guess. Oh, sorry, I mistyped there. Come on. Yep, I'm okay with that. That looks good. And let's decrease that to something like 16. Just keep it low in the min. As soon as you have reached the image you want, just keep this low to something like 16 or 32 or something like that. And it works. And now render the entire image and make sure that your depth of field looks great. Yep, I think I'm pretty happy with that. That looks good. Yep, that looks good. Okay. All right, let's do this. Okay, and now we have set up the unified sampler. Now, if we render our final image, we should get a pretty clean image. Let's see what happens. This could take a moment. There we go. I think we got a pretty satisfactory result. It's not perfect, but most of the time you don't need to get rid of all the noise in a scene. And even if you want to, you can usually get something like this and then just apply one of the Redshift denoisers on it, which usually give you really good results. But I don't like using them because I add a little bit of grain into my images afterwards anyways, so I don't really need it. All right, this is the result. And if you go into your AOVs now, you can see that pretty much every AOV is, well, this is not clean in the AOV, but here it looks really clean. It's just something you have to get a feeling for a little bit, but you learn that fast enough. Refractions look pretty clean. This is still a bit noisy, but you know, the beauty still looks okay, especially from distance. We could probably add some more samples into that, but you know, not really necessary. And the SSS looks pretty good. Shadows look okay. And the final image is, I'd say it's pretty clean. Let's just take a look at it. And it's re-rendering because I resized the image editor. Of course it does. Sometimes I hate my head. Because I still have fit window original size. That's where we go. And now it's going to render in 720p. Okay, I promise you another setting where you can just ignore all this and get a pretty satisfactory image anyways. I'm just going to show you. Please don't use it, because if you ever have a problem rendering an image in Redshift, this is not going to help you. But let's just name this render setting. I am a Redshift god. And then make a new one and call this I am not good at Redshift. Go into the Redshift settings, set it up like that. If we render now, we should get our default image again. Let's set it to fit window. Now we should get our not so great default image because we have standard unified sampling images again. The only thing that takes time rendering now is the shadows pretty much from the dome light. And what you can do is you go to System, scroll down to Experimental Options, and you enable Automatic Sampling. So what this does is pretty much ignore everything you give Redshift as settings in the basic menu. So ignores this, it ignores this, etc., etc. And you usually get a pretty good result because the only thing it takes into account is your adaptive error threshold. So if you increase that, you get a grainier image. And it pretty much internally decides, okay, I need this many samples, blah, blah, blah. The thing is, it's usually a little slower. You don't have as much control over your scene because sometimes you can get away with more noise in certain areas than others. Sometimes it has problems getting rid of noise and depth of field areas, especially if they are way more extreme than this. And it really doesn't like volumetrics. I have only had issues rendering volumetrics with automatic sampling. So for quick preview renderings or something like that, I'd say it's okay using automatic sampling, but if I don't have to explain this to somebody, it usually takes like 10 to 15 minutes to set a scene up, even if it's more complicated, to make it, you know, acceptable in speed and quality range. So I just don't use the automatic sampling at all, at least not until they fix the couple of issues it has. So yeah, I hope you liked this video. I hope I could show you something and help you a little bit understanding the Redshift render. I plan on doing more Redshift related tutorials in the future. So thanks for watching. Consider subscribing and pressing the nice upvote button. And see you next time. Bye bye.